So hello, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces and good to see some unfamiliar faces too. Thank you so much for coming. This is our fourth in our event of our Women Leaders in Technology series. We have 6 live interview series. And my name is Wei Zheng. I'm Associate Professor of Management in the School of Business. I'm also the Richard R. Rossett Chair in Leadership. And Stephen's Leadership Portal, which has an experimental site in my bag, is a new initiative at the School of Business for us to help people connect to leader stories, cutting edge research, and learning communities. And so we want to provide you with resources and fresh perspectives to tackle various problems you encounter in your work contexts. So today we have Stephanie Rowe with us, but before we get started, I'd like to invite you to join a very short breakout room session so you get to know who else are here in our audience. We have a relatively small audience today. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the little chance to get to know some of the other participants just a little bit, so it feels like a community. I wish it's a true setting, but hopefully we replicate some of the opportunities to socialize, to get to know other participants in the same room. So it is my great pleasure now to welcome Stephanie Rowe. Thank you for coming, Stephanie. So Stephanie is currently an entrepreneur in product design and innovation. She worked as a senior executive in larger organizations, such as managing director at Accenture and program executive at TSA. She now advises startups and has her own company that designs educational smart home technology products for children. She also has extensive experience developing hardware and software products, leading large-scale technology implementation programs. She's also a speaker, panelist, podcast guest, and expert judge on topics, including a whole wide range of expertise, including customer service, design thinking, innovation, product design and development, entrepreneurship, business transformation, building ventures, and women in technology. So Stephanie, welcome to our event, and thank you for being willing to share your experience and insights with us. You're on mute.
It keeps remuting me. Thank you for telling me that. It's so exciting to be here. Thank you so much for that awesome intro. Listening to that, I'm like, God, maybe I actually do know something. As an entrepreneur on any given day, I feel like I don't know anything. So it's really nice to hear that. So I'm psyched to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let's get started. In the first part of our conversation, I'll be asking most of the questions, but feel free for the rest of you, please do type in your questions into the chat box as well, and we'll answer them as they come up. And in the second part of our event, we'll open the mic and anybody can chime in and for a question. So Stephanie, could you tell us how you got interested in technology in the first place?
Yeah, it's really funny. I was thinking about this recently, and I think it comes from just a more broad curiosity. So I would say my mother laughs. She says, when I was a little kid, I had like kids have cardboard houses. I actually had a storefront, which on hindsight now, looking back at this, it's actually really funny. So I actually wanted a storefront. And apparently when I was little, I used to love to push buttons. So whether that was like on a cash register or, whatever. And so she's like, so I had this digital cash register, and people could come to the store and buy things, and I could push the buttons. And I don't know if that's like the earliest time when I was really little, because that was before smartphones, right? I mean, it's a way long time ago. And so I find it funny now looking back at that. And so I think it was, one, I was always just a very curious person, but two, apparently, according to my mother, even all the way back, I just loved things I could interact with and buttons I could push. So I think it started a long time ago.
That's really interesting. And so let's continue with your time at TSA, which is an interesting organization that a lot of us has experience with, but we never thought about the organization itself, but we have all had experience with them. So what kind of, maybe could you give us one major project you worked on there, and what made it successful? What were the challenges and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So just for context, my background, I majored in MIS, the Management Information Systems, coming out of undergrad. And my first job was as a programmer. And so I kind of started, so I'm a tech person kind of from, undergrad all the way through my time at Accenture. And then how I found myself at TSA, which in my wildest dreams, I never thought, if people would have said, where are you going to work? I would have never said, oh, I'm going to work at TSA and Homeland Security. It just was not on the list. And so I found myself for a variety of reasons, the head of TSA called me and said, will you come to work at TSA? And so that's how I found myself there. I didn't seek it out. I was at Accenture and I got recruited there for my large scale business transformation leadership skills. And I was asked to run all of their digital identity. So what that means is like identity management, all sorts of background checks. So TSA does like physical pat you down. That's I think how a lot of people think about it, like at the checkpoint. They also have something called Secure Flight, which is a program that when you buy an airline ticket, you put on your full name, date of birth, and gender, and it does a name-based comparison against the watch list. So that's an example of a background check program. Or all flight crews in any plane that goes in, out, or over the United States, all of those flight crews get vetted. So I did anything that was a digital identity background check or comparison against the watch list. So any sort of, like there's the physical part, which I worked on but wasn't responsible for, but the digital side, I was responsible for building and running all of their identity management systems, which I can talk more about. It was an entire suite of programs. TSA PreCheck is one that I didn't have at the time, but I had another program called Registered Traveler that was like that. So I was responsible for all of that, which was really interesting. And I can talk about the challenges of that. And then I also ran something that was called Checkpoint Evolution, which about a year into my tenure at TSA, the administrator asked me to also take on that. And so I took on that project, and that was all about innovation. So you can almost think about it as like a chief innovation officer role. It was cross-functional. I had a team that was across the entire organization, and it was everything from retraining the security officers to looking at liquid technologies that would basically look for detect explosives, to, if you know, now when you go to the airport, those, we call them the whole body imager machines, but they're like an octagon, I think, and they sit there and they do the little swoop for like completely redoing the checkpoint technology. So it was like everything related to the checkpoint, kind of trying to reimagine it and bring new technology to it from the bottom up. So those were the two different programs. And I think what was really interesting for me going into TSA was, I think as many of you know, like TSA has a horrible reputation, right? Like it's like the worst. I'm like not sure, like IRS might be worse, but in terms of places to go and work, like, and I was coming from Accenture, which had a great brand, and I went to one that had a terrible brand, and people were like, have you lost your mind? Like, why are you doing that? But I did it, and I thought of it more as giving back to my country and my skills. And so that's kind of how I thought about it. But what was really interesting is, how do you hire people? So I was responsible for taking over a suite of programs that were basically broken. So they had spent, like Secure Flight, it had spent, when I arrived, it had spent $124 million, violated the Privacy Act, and had deployed nothing. So it was a mess. And so I think that in terms of going in and doing transformation and making change, I was hired to come in to do that. But I was lucky because when stuff is a mess and broken, it's easier. Like the change, like if you've heard the term, the burning platform was clear, like that it had to change, right? And so I went in and I'm known as a change agent. So that's kind of my reputation. So people are like, uh-oh, there's like a new sheriff in town. And so that made it easier. But talking about like motivating people was, there's so many tools you have to motivate people. And in the government, I couldn't offer them brand because like TSA is a bad brand, right? So it's like, let me just swear, it's a bad brand. And the government doesn't pay a lot. So what do you have? So I think in terms of trying to motivate people, what did I have? I had compelling mission. You are going to be able to, help secure airplanes. And on Secure Flight before the pandemic, it vetted over 2 million people a day. So I was trying to hire a head of Secure Flight, and it's like, I can give you massive scale programs that affect, U.S. citizens and beyond every single day. So, depending upon what you're doing, I think you have to look for what is it that's motivating about that particular thing, because you might not have brand or money. And so just thinking about and when you have a startup, and that's even a whole nother situation, how do you hire and motivate people? But I don't know if I answered your question, but those are the two things I did at TSA, and both interesting for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. It's very helpful to know what specific things or targets or goals that you try to achieve. So in TSA, which is sort of, you mentioned in our prior conversation, sort of like a former military culture. And I assume it's very bureaucratic as well. So how did you make those large scale changes? I assume there must be having some resistance or cross departmental conflicts or overlaps or other sort of things. How did you navigate that? Did you have any of the conflicts or resistance like that?
Oh
How
my
did you
gosh, yes.
navigate around that?
It was so painful. Like I came from private sector, right? So I was a private sector person. I wasn't former military, former law enforcement, or even former government. And so going into an organization that is heavily law enforcement and former military was really interesting because in business and private sector where I had come from, your kind of currency was, what were your skills? What did you do? And you relied on people to help you bring those skills to the table to get something done. And you had specific goals. Where in law enforcement, if you're running into a building where people are shooting at you, you care more about, does that other person have your back? And it's a very different mentality. And so sometimes I would be like, why are they making those decisions, or why are they operating in that way? And once I stopped to kind of take a step back and think like, what's going on here? You know, it starts to make sense when you start to look at what is the culture and the experience of people in the military or law enforcement. And I think that for me, as a student of, student of and expert in design thinking and empathy and understanding like how you need to design for people, the biggest thing I would say about, when I go into an organization to make change, I go in as a wide-eyed child, and I go in to try to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I come from a place of not judging that organization, but my success is dependent upon how much change I can make. I have to really understand just everything about that organization. And I say to people, I'm going to ask tough questions and hard questions, but it doesn't come from judgment. It comes from trying to deeply understand, because once you understand, you can actually start to architect and put together the structures that are going to help you move that organization. And, and I think most people know this through change, like, they say like a third, and a third, like a third are on board, a third you have to convince, and a third have to leave, right? So, I had a boss and I was brought in to make change. And so, given all what I just said, yes, you're designing for the best adoption for that organization, whether that's transforming secure flight, or in the case of security evolution, one of the biggest things we did is we were trying to give the frontline security officers more autonomy on decision-making and more power, so that citizens don't feel like rules are stupid, right? Because a lot of times people think the rules are stupid. So you're trying to work within the bounds and keep the country safe, but by giving the security officer on the front line more power for decision-making, that was massively, massively scary. So that was probably the hardest thing, because for a lot of reasons, from a legal perspective, from a security perspective, from a, aesthetics, just how's that going to look to the public? And, they're going to make mistakes, and, TSA is a lightning rod for, the media. So I think just thinking about, all those things helps you shape how can you get the most adoption, but you also have to understand that sometimes you have to move people out. Like I moved out a lot of people, and you just have to do that. I don't do that. I don't walk in doing that, but I do that after really kind of trying to diagnose and understand what needs to be done. And sometimes, sometimes people are blocked. They just can't make a change. And sometimes it's just wrong skills in the wrong roles, right? I mean, it's just a mismatch.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So can we dwell on this point a little bit in terms of understanding new place culture? Let's imagine you're a consultant, and this probably has to do with your current consulting role as well. You need to quickly understand what the clients want and the culture is like, right? The mentalities are. So what about, let's imagine you're walking into Stevens in our university, and what are some questions would you ask? What are some things you would do to help you quickly acclimate to the culture of a new organization like Stevens, let's say?
Yeah, I would first start to say like, who's bringing me in and what level, and trying to frame. Well, one thing I always do when I go into a new place is I create what's called a power map, and I literally take the organization and I map it out. I did this when I was at Accenture as well, and I take the entire org chart top to bottom, and I color code it. I color code it with like, it's less about the functions and it's more about the power. So like who has power, who doesn't, who's an influencer, who's been there, longer, newer. And like, I try to map in the leadership boxes kind of all the way down. And then when you're trying to say, okay, what is an organization trying to do? So you want to frame, it may be something like TSA, like the head of TSA brought me in and we were making change there. Well, that doesn't always have to be at the top. It could be something within a division or a unit. So you want to understand like who is asking for this change? Why are they asking for this change? And what does the outcome look like? I think first of all, you're trying to get a picture of where they want to go. And then after that, you want to say, how well equipped are they to get there? So that's, it's generally not like, it's generally like, okay, let's say you're going to implement a new technology. The hard part is generally not the technology implementation. I mean, you can solve technical issues. It's generally the human problem, or it could be external problems coming in. So, understanding not only the internal influences, but also the external that are coming in and pressing on the organization. So like at TSA, you have a lot of that, right? You can't do anything the Hill doesn't want. The public is a massive influencer. If you ask the airlines to do too much, the airlines get mad and they're going to go lobby the Hill. So depending upon the organization, I can potentially see this at a university, you may have a lot of external factors that are them imposing. So I start to say, okay, given this change, like who are then I start to get more diagnostic and say, if I've got the leader here, if the leader has a clear vision, if the leader actually can, basically has the wherewithal and the desire to do this, then I start to move out from there. So I think it starts with clear vision. What do they want to do? Are they themselves like ready to do this? Because of the, change is hard. And if they're not ready to do it and make hard decisions, then it's, massive change. I mean, I know you guys all know this, massive change really does, it just starts at the top. And I think that what you can do is help a leader, if they haven't been through it before, understand how hard it's going to be and help them understand maybe blind spots that they're not seeing in terms of, as an example, stakeholders that they may need to start bringing along now, where they may not have thought about the breadth of the change. They may say, okay, I want to go from here to there, but I hadn't thought about who are all the people that are going to be impacted by this.
Great. I like the idea of a power map. So it basically prepares your mental set in terms of where the priorities are in terms of your work. Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to offer one. So I was on a
please.
Project with a large oil company, and we were doing an SAP implementation. And it was actually going to change, this is several years ago, it was actually going to change how the jobs were done. So I created a massive power map at the headquarters building in a conference room, and that's where all the executives were, and just literally put it on the wall. And any of those executives could walk in and they could look and could see what functions of SAP were going to hit their organization where. And they just loved it because it started to it kind of overlaid, that kind of brought together kind of power, but with the change. And it was really helpful. Just I had forgotten I had done that until something you said made me think about it. And I was like, oh wow, that was really helpful. Like the leaders really liked it because I don't think they understood how that system was going to impact their organization. And like down how far, how much, how many employees, and there it was visually kind of all mapped out. And I think it helped them get their arms around it. That's a great idea. So it's not just your personal mental map, it can be a shared mental map. So people are on the same page in terms of where the progress needs to be made. Yeah. Interesting. Let's pivot a little bit in terms of career choices. So you have an interesting career. You started with MIS, you got into product development, and you worked for Accenture consulting, and then TSA is a very different organization. And then you join other organizations like Fortify, Smartking. And next you have your own product and development or innovation firm. So how did you choose that route? Because the context of this is that some of in our audience are at different stages of their career. Some are just about to embark on their formal career. Some are in the middle and transitioning, pivoting. Some are toward the end and wanting to maybe learn something new. So how did you make those career choices? Such an interesting question. This is going to be maybe too much insight into my personality, but I am high energy, type A, and I mentioned way back in the beginning, I'm a very curious person. So by the way, I started my undergrad degree in fashion merchandising. And this goes back to the power of toys, and why I can talk about jewels, but I had a sister. and there were no boys in my household, and we just didn't have a lot of boy toys, that are like building toys and maker toys and things like that. So I never had a lot of exposure. We didn't have Legos. Like I'd never had exposure to that stuff. So I went into college majoring in fashion merchandising. Ended up by, a freak accident, I guess, ended up taking computer science, loving it, and then had an awesome professor, and ended up changing my major from fashion merchandising to MIS, which makes me the statistic for girls in STEM, right? Like most of them find their way to STEM by chance, which is the source of the inspiration for my company, Jules. But when I went into, so I decided I was going to major in MIS, loved that. I had a lot of job offers coming out of school. One with 2 in oil companies doing computer work, one at Accenture, then I did another consulting company, and then another one to join GE's management training program. And at the end of the day, I ended up choosing Accenture because or at Anderson Consulting at the time, because I just didn't know what I wanted to do. And all I knew there was I didn't have to choose, and there'd be a whole bunch of stuff I could do. I could change industries, I could change geographies. If I didn't like the people I was working with, that would change. If I loved them, it would change. Like I wanted to travel. So, it was the best decision I ever made to take a job in consulting. It was perfect for my personality, and culture really matters. And I fit in culturally, except when I was 22 or 21, however old I was, like, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what it meant to be a cultural fit. Like, what did that feel like? I understood the words, but I didn't know what that meant. And so that was, so I got lucky, and I chose there, and I stayed there 15 and a half years and went from, basically analyst to partner. And so then, like I said, TSA was just kind of a freak, occurrence where, I got called and said, will you join TSA? But over the course of time, like I started in tech, and then Anderson Consulting or Accenture had people, process, technology, these 3 buckets. And I was like, oh, tech is super interesting. But then like the people side was really interesting to me because I was building stuff people weren't using. I'm like, well, let me go and kind of work on the people side. So then I went over and I worked on change management and org design and role design and job design, because it was like a missing puzzle piece in my tech space. So I went over and did that. And then I'm like, well, this is all interesting, but then it all kind of comes back to process. And then I worked in operational process, but it was out of a curiosity and an understanding of trying to solve big problems. And there are many different puzzle pieces that have to come together to solve those problems. So once I felt like I kind of understood the tech side, or I understood the people side, now I'm like, oh, well, what about operational process stuff? So I went and did that, which I wish I could say it was purposeful, but it wasn't. It was more out of curiosity and trying to say, what's the next piece that I don't feel comfortable? Like, what am I missing? Like, I don't feel like an expert in these areas. And I would go seek and build skills in those areas. And that led me to having a skill set of this transformation person. So now I can go in and transform almost anything because I have deep tech skills. I've got the operational process analysis, like throughput stuff. And then I've also got the people side, which is one of the reasons Kip Holly was so interested in hiring me at TSA, was because TSA has all those. They have technology, they have serious operational challenges around throughput, people through a checkpoint, like time trials matter, like how long somebody stands at the travel document checker or at the x-ray machine, like it really matters. And so then in my time at TSA, of all places, I realized that I was missing the upfront innovation piece. So I was really good at, I always thought of myself as technical, analytical, and that's awesome. And deploying and building anything. You want it, like, tell me what you're gonna build, I will build it and deploy it, and it's gonna be awesome, right? But in terms of inventing and saying, let's create a new business model, or let's invent a new line of business or a new consumer product, I was like, well, I don't know how to do that. And it seems to me more and more relevant, given the world that we were in, especially with trends of IoT coming and other things, that I need to know how to do that. And so, again, just by freaks of nature, just like this accidents, I guess, or happy accidents, Kip Holly, my boss, wanted to hire a design and innovation firm, which you may know, called IDEO. I had never heard of IDEO. And so I'm like, okay, awesome. Like, who are these peeps? And let's get to let's figure it out, right? So I was leading that innovation team. Well, we hired IDEO as TSA. So I was basically IDEO's lead. I was the client lead for them. And I ran a 75-person IDEO team. it turns out I was like, oh my God, like these are my people. Like, I was like, it was so interesting because I was like, oh my God, they have tools and methods and language and structure for helping me build and invent new things. And these were sort of things that I was starting to learn or that I could almost have intuition about, but I didn't realize that there was a whole, vocabulary and suite of tools. And so that was really interesting to me because I felt like it brought like almost my left brain and right brain, or my creative and my technical analytical side, into balance. And so I led that team at TSA. Then after that, I came out and I decided to start my own consulting company. And I wanted to learn more about this, kind of design innovation space. And so I ended up, IDEO hired me with my consulting company to actually help them operationalize things, because they're really good on the upfront piece, but not so good on the back end piece, right? So we were a good pairing. So I worked, and they hired me as a consultant for like a year. And so that better helped me help them with the back end process. And they helped me learn the upfront process. And what all of that, and I ended up like teaching at the D school and getting to know David Kelly really well. And so what that allowed me to do was build this skill set that's from, like, I'm going to call it start to finish, but like invention of new things all the way through deployment. And I wish I could say that, like, again, it was purposeful, but it was more about almost like, maybe it was more like reaching the end of my knowledge and kind of what I was doing and trying to take the next challenge and realizing that I didn't have certain skills. And I'm coupled with my just curiosity in general. I'm like, oh, I want to go learn that. And I'm very much about, like, I want to work on stuff that's interesting. And so how do I create those opportunities for myself? So I'm generally the person that's like, oh, what's this latest interesting tech or trend? And I go check it out and learn about it. And then that experience is what led me to Jules. But I'll stop there and see if that's helpful.
Yes, it is very much. Thank you. So, so let me pursue this line just a little bit. So what helps you in terms of, on the one hand, you're pursuing some new knowledge, some unknown. Was there fear, or maybe you're leveraging both what you already know and just and plunging into what you haven't known yet? How did you balance that?
That's such a good question. So when I came out of TSA, I knew that I wanted to pivot my career in kind of a new direction. And so I'm nothing if not purposeful about like plans. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to set a rule, and I'm going to spend 50% of my time doing consulting around Homeland Security because I know it really well. And it turns out that's lucrative. People will pay me for that, right? And I'm going to use that time and that money to pivot me to where I want to go. So the other 50% of my time, I'm going to take that money and I'm going to use it to, go to training, to, do all these activities. Or some of that stuff is just, I need to build a network in this space. And it's not so much about, making money or costing money. It's about just time to kind of learn and build your network. So my first, I would say, year and a half to 2 years out of TSA, I was trying to pivot myself in that direction by using my, I would say my Accenture background and my Homeland Security experience as the core to pivot me to get there. But I wasn't where I wanted to be, but I was on a very tactical step to say, I want to go to this class and I want to do these things. And I'm slowly but surely going to pivot myself there. And then I started taking on more and more work that was more design innovation than Homeland Security. And so now, interesting, some of my clients are a bit of both, right? They have invented new technologies and they're trying to figure out where and how to use it in a Homeland Security space. So that's kind of maybe a meeting of both worlds.
Wonderful. So that's very helpful to know. You didn't just plunge in 100%.
No.
You gradually moved.
I gradually moved.
Yeah.
And I would say my startup was different. And my startup was really scary to me because I was, and because I was doing a tech startup. When you do consulting, that's easier because you can pay yourself and pivot as you go. But when you do a tech startup, unless you're independently wealthy, which I'm not, like, you can't really do that. Like, you have to bootstrap it, or you have to try to, go raise money, which I have done all of those things now. But that was harder and scarier because you aren't going to make any money doing that. Especially, we ended up doing hardware for a long time because the development cycle of hardware is so much longer than software. And so that was scarier. And I can talk about that and being an entrepreneur and advice I would give to entrepreneurs. later if that's, if we want to talk about that.
Great. Let's go there. Let's go there now. So you talked about Jules. That's your own technology company where you build products. Actually, you have to sell them, right? In addition to designing and inventing everything.
Right.
So what are some key lessons learned or key insights you generated in that journey?
Yeah, from a personal perspective, so I think from, if I were giving advice to a new entrepreneur, there's so much out there that tells you how to get started as an entrepreneur, right? Which is awesome. And those resources are super important and they're great. And I leveraged a lot of them in the Cambridge area. I think the one thing that I did really right was to set some parameters around, let me take a step back for a second. I think the one thing that nobody talks about that is really important if you're going to start a company is equally around how do you get started is how do you know when to stop? I can't tell you how many friends I have that, ended up divorced, sold their homes, they basically made themselves financially destitute. And so I was coming from a place of I wasn't starting a company when I was 22 or 23. I had money. And so I ended up taking a mortgage against my home, a part of it to basically fund some of my startup. But what I did get right was I'm like, I'm not going to, this is the amount of money I have. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to take this calculated risk financially. I'm taking this amount of money out of my mortgage and I'm comfortable with that. When this money is gone, if there's no more money, I'm stopping because I upfront agreed with and I had a husband. So I agreed with him. This upfront was the amount of money. It turns out, I think, now looking back at it, I should have set other parameters. I should have set parameters around timing. I should have set more specific milestones that are, okay, if you can't raise X amount of money by this time, or if I can't get, traction for a product by this time. So I would have set, and I'm not talking about a lot of metrics. I'm talking about just, 3 or 4 or 5. How do you know when to stop? Because the mistake people make, I think, sometimes as individual entrepreneurs is they go too long and they literally destroy their lives. I can't tell you how many people I know that have done that. So that's, I think, probably my biggest piece of advice would be for yourself, kind of setting that up, up front. I'll stop there for a second, but I think those are if I were doing it again, I would absolutely set a series of metrics. And I don't know why someone hasn't written a book on that, because I think it's really important.
Right, because people usually say, well, go from your heart and where your heart is telling you, and go all in and rah. And so it's
totally, but it's a 95% failure. It's a 95% failure rate, 95%. Yeah. So help yourself know, because and the thing is, there was this term in grad school, this one professor used, and I'll never forget it. He said, he goes, you don't want to be one of the walking dead. He goes, that's the worst scenario. He goes, if you crash and burn, and that's easier than if you're a walking dead company, which means you're getting enough success. You're not getting enough for it to really take off, but you're not getting enough success for it to crash and burn. So they're he called it the walking dead. And I just will never forget it because I see so many walking dead companies now. And this goes back to, it just takes them too long to fail. And they, time is money. And especially as you get older, and if you're going to try again, you want to know that it's not working and move on to the next thing, and know that it's okay to let it go. Because I don't know that we talk a lot about that. It's okay to let it go. And when do you let it go? Almost everything is on the upside and how do you get started?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for offering that piece of wisdom. So let's pivot a little bit about STEM, about inclusivity, about women in STEM. You have spoken on this topic, and Jules is part of your effort, if I understand correctly, to help create an environment that's more gender inclusive in STEM. So, and you have a saying from from our prior conversation, technology has a branding problem. Yes. Could you elaborate on that a little bit and talk about what you have perceived as
Sure.
Not that inclusive yet in the STEM industries?
Right. I think this is as you know, Wei, this is a huge area of passion for me, especially as a woman that started, in fashion merchandising, that found her way into tech. I wouldn't be talking here to you today, and I wouldn't have had the opportunities if I hadn't found my way kind of into technology. And so I think that, I started, when I came out of grad school, I was I want to build a tech company, but I didn't know exactly which one or what it was. So I started my company, Jules, from the place of, I want to solve a problem I care about. And there's many I could work on, but the one I want to work on is the lack of girls and women in STEM. And so I started from, why is that a problem? Like, what is it about that circumstance? Like, why does that exist as a thing? And so I started from that place to try to figure out how might I solve that. And so the more that I dug into it, I was looking at everything from how do kids develop to, later stage career things. And I kind of peeled it all back to and learned, and I didn't know this because, I was an enterprise software person from Homeland Security, and I'm now working in the space of consumer products for children. So this was not at all my background. And I think a lot of times that's how innovation happens. People come in from the outside because they are not bound by the same barriers that other people that are in the industry have those barriers. And so I started from that point of view, and I started to just look at, what I did know was that going to the toy aisles, like you go to Target or Walmart, right? And the toy aisles are like pink for girls and blue for boys. And I mean, everybody knows it, and that's just kind of how it is. It just, for like a decade, it would just infuriate me every time I would go to the store. I would just leave angry. And so I'm like, well, why is that? And once I dug into a few things, I dug into child development, and I dug into how are toys made? So how does Hasbro, how does Mattel, like what is their user experience design? Like how do they invent toys? And I started to learn that toys are made by a very small group of, guess what, male engineer toy inventors. And then the more that I understood about that industry and how toys are invented, the more I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. And so what I realized was that the set of contexts by which we teach children STEM are very narrow. So it is cars, trucks, and this is several years ago now. So this is changing, thank goodness. It's changing. I don't think as fast and as big as it needs to, but that set of contexts are cars, trucks, drones, robots, right? So it's a very narrow set. And so I was like, well, why don't we just broaden this? Like if we can broaden this, and it wasn't so much that I was designing for girls, I was designing beyond the default, this default of cars, trucks, drones, helicopters, and robots, to, in designing for inclusion, to be less about no, not those, more about what about this also? And so I started just doing, like I said, did a ton of market research, but then I did a lot of ethnographic research. I mean, I spent a lot of time in toy stores. I bought tons of toys, like you name it, I bought it and tried it. And then and also I think my time at MIT in the MIT Media Lab was super helpful because I got context around what is happening with technology. Oh, interesting. Electronics are getting really small. They are, fabric is becoming conductive. There's all of this stuff going on around pure tech and technology. And there was a group at MIT called High Low Tech, and it's basically, technology that's, not the way you would normally think about it. So it would be, like wearable technology or, again, technology as fabric. And that was a lot of inspiration for the work. And then I started looking at arts and crafts and recognizing arts and crafts is $1 billion industry, largely targeted at girls, but not exclusively. And yet I was like, this is really interesting. There's not a piece of technology to be found, but now technology, you can actually, like, what if we brought technology into arts and crafts? What if we fused those things together and started from a place of, basically decorating rooms? Like all kids, especially girls, want to decorate their rooms. So how might technology make decorating, designing your room, decorating your room, how might technology make that cooler? And so it was by kind of just deeply understanding what was out there, what tech was coming, what were girls trying to do, that I blended those different elements together to invent the Jules product line. And it was coming from a place of, it's not all girls want to build. Like when I started this, I'm like, well, maybe girls don't want to build, but it turns out that was the case because I did a ton of research and they all wanted to build. They just didn't want to build anything that was out there. And so what I've learned over time is that by changing the context, you engage, people, kids in an entirely different way. And so that's kind of one thing. And then I think when I say that tech, or engineering has a branding problem, it's, so much, like almost any engineering class that you take, the context through which they're taught is also very masculine. So I had this as one example. I had an intern a young woman from Pennsylvania. And she basically, and we were working on a lighting product for room. And she's like, oh my God, she goes, this is so interesting. She goes, I was taking a class about lighting and Fresnel lenses. And, you know, she was a mechanical engineer and like all this engineering. And she said, we were doing it based on a car headlight. And she said, I couldn't have cared less about that car headlight and where it was going and how it was. She's like, I just didn't care about the headlights of a car. And she's like, if you would have told me that now I need to solve this problem to create light, like diffusing and focusing light patterns in cool ways to add interesting patterns on the wall, she's like, that would have changed my entire perspective on it. She goes, what I've learned now when I go back to school is if I don't like the context or if I'm not inspired by the context through which the engineering is being taught, I can actually change that context. So I would have never thought about that. So there's so much in this whole idea of context and bringing things to people in contexts that are relevant to them. Or in this case, like she mentioned, I would have never occurred to me to teach somebody a different context so they can apply themselves.
That's a really critical insight in terms of not just getting girls into STEM, but pushing STEMs or helping people to see how STEMs apply in all kinds of contexts that we haven't tried before, we haven't focused on before. I love that idea. Thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, and so everything is about that brand. And so whether it's Mark Zuckerberg in a hoodie or whether it's there were some experiments done about like computer science clubs at universities. And it was, some of them had very, you know, tech bro-ish kind of advertisements, and other of them took it and said, okay, we're going to think about technology through solving sustainable problems. The exact same content, two different brandings, like massively different attendance of women in each of those. Mm-hmm. So it is the brand, it is how it's presented. You know, I think engineering, I think wrongly, has this brand that it's, oh, you know, it's going to be, you know, some dude with a hoodie sitting in a dark room by himself coding. Well, if you're doing that, then your product is probably not going to be very good, because if you don't have any user input, or I don't know what to tell you, because I would say it is, you know, the tech build and design and development is equally as important as talking to the people and what problem are you solving, and those things really have to come together. Mm-hmm. So, but there's so much of this, you know, hoodie tech bro, code in a room by yourself all night long kind of brand. Mm-hmm. And I just feel like engineering, whether it's, you know, classes at universities or, you know, things that are more broad, they just have a very masculine brand associated with them. You can go look at the engineering, like the associations that are engineering, they're very, they're very masculine brands, which is fine, just not broad enough to be inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's profound. That's profound. I love it. The branding idea, the application. That's wonderful. So, so now you're you're doing consulting in this product innovation and design space. And I think some in our audience today are interested in that space, maybe. Could you talk about maybe what are some key factors that help you stand out in that space? And I assume there can be a lot of competition, people interested. What does it take to be successful in that space?
I think what it takes to be, I think it takes, what I would say is, depending upon what you're doing, but you have to have some sort of expertise. I think what they're looking for, I think IDEO calls them T-shaped people. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but basically deep skill in one area, but then broadly understanding how do you invent, like basically how do you invent products? So you might be deep in, you know, UX design as an example, and you bring that skill to bear, but you're also good at understanding the entire kind of life cycle at a higher level. So I think it's not good enough to say, I understand at a high level all of this, you know, unless you have enough experience to kind of lead initiatives. But if you're younger, I think you have to come from a place of expertise, whether that's electrical engineering or UI or UX design or coding, whatever that is. I think starting from that point of view, but then having, you know, basically a curious mindset, and having, I think curiosity and empathy are two really important things coupled with your deep expertise. So to me, you know, I think it's about kind of being a well-rounded person. Like I said, IDEO calls them T-shaped people, but to me, it's about being well-rounded. Can you do the creative? And I think this is so important. And I think you probably all know this, but like, stuff is changing, you know, the world is changing so fast that you have to have the skills, like, CEOs now, they have to know how to invent new business models, because their business model is probably going to turn old very much faster. If you go back 40 years, the life cycle of business models was a lot longer. That life cycle of business models is really a lot shorter. And so when I say business model, I'm really talking about inventing new ways of operating, new product offerings, new service offerings. And so I think being able to have that creative side coupled with the technical, deployment and execution, is the ideal kind of mix. It lets you be able to play in almost any space you want. So if I were advising people, I would say, young kids coming or younger students coming up, I would say, pick what your core is, but then have interests more broadly, but make sure you're focused on how to solve problems and how to really understand how to do that with humans or for humans.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to stop my questions here and give our audience a chance to ask you questions directly. So please feel free just to unmute yourselves and just speak up with your question. Yeah. We have a question from Rebecca. Rebecca, would you like to give more context to your question, or would you like just me to read it?
Sure. Stephanie, what excites you most about the next 3 to 5 years on the horizon? What is most exciting to you, given your background?
Oh, that's super interesting. I would say one of the areas, there's a lot, like I think the pandemic has accelerated a lot of trends that were already coming. And I think one of the most exciting areas to me is actually around education, kind of at all levels, the university level, kind of all the way down. You're seeing a lot of tech investment in education. And so I think that we have, what do they say, it takes 20 times for a behavior to become a habit? Well, virtual, like we have had a year of kind of all virtual and people working. So I feel like the humans are actually ahead of the technology, which doesn't normally happen. And so normally you have the tech kind of pulling people along. But I think in this case, the people's behavior, we're kind of like, we're coping with Zoom. And I was looking at Zoom today, like, again, they're releasing new features so fast, all kinds of stuff I hadn't even thought of. Like, you can change your eyebrows. Like, it was like these studios, like, it was so interesting. And so I think that in the case of education, and maybe there's a broader, message here around collaboration. So I think collaboration software that I think was kind of maybe a boring laggard before is now, I think, the adoption curve has come so far by humans that I think that you're going to see a lot of really cool tech innovation there. And I think that is going to open up and unlock a lot of really interesting things in the education space. And second to that would be healthcare. I think the same thing is true for healthcare. So I would say, I think where ed tech is going is really, really interesting and a lot of opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. Our time with you is up. I hope to keep connecting with you, and maybe one day we can help rebrand technology and STEM in some big way that can be helpful to other people. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and insights.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the questions and the engagement. And if I can be helpful to any of you, please reach out. Please reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to help. And Wei, thank you so much. You are delightful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.